This is a 2018 Kia Stinger GT. It's a 365 horsepower rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive luxury performance sedan from Kia. It costs over $50,000 for a Kia. Today, I'm gonna find out if it's worth it. But first, a little background. Kia first came to the US market in 1995 with a crappy little SUV called the Sportage and a crappy little compact car called the Sophia. At the time, they were a laughingstock, but over the years, they've gotten better and better, making excellent, stylish cars that people actually want to buy, to the point where they now feel confident enough to put out a rear-wheel drive sports sedan like a BMW, except it's a Kia. And yet, on paper, it looks pretty good. There's a base model with a turbocharged four-cylinder that makes 255 horsepower, which is pretty strong. But this is the one that everybody's talking about, the Stinger GT, with a 365 horsepower twin-turbo V6 and rear or all-wheel drive. And it doesn't just look good on paper. Take a look at this thing. This is an attractive car with handsome, gorgeous lines and excellent proportions. This is a Kia that you don't buy because it's the best value three-row SUV with a 10-year, 100,000-mile warranty. This is a car you buy because you want to. And it's a Kia. I've borrowed this Stinger GT from Kia of Cerritos here in the Los Angeles area. They have a few Stingers and Stinger GTs in their inventory. You can check them out if you click the link in the description below. Now, I'm truly excited to check this thing out today and find out if Kia has now become a credible player in the luxury sports sedan world. Today, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Stinger GT, and I'm going to show you all of its quirks and features, and then I'm going to get it out on the road and see how it drives, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. For now, on to the quirks. I'm going to start up front with the headlights, and specifically the running lights. Like all cars, this one has LED running lights, but take a look at them. They look aggressive and mean and luxurious, and definitely not like any of the other Kias that you usually see. Also in the headlights, take a look at the turn signals. Those look especially cool. It's like a fighter squadron of blinking lights every time you put on the turn signal. That's one of the coolest turn signal looks I've seen in the car business. And speaking of the turn signals, moving on to the mirror turn signals, it's not like in every other car where it's just a little light on the side that lights up. Instead, there's a little style to it. It sort of kinks on the bottom, and at the end, there's a little dot of light, which is kind of unusual. Maybe more unusual is the trim on the outside of the mirror itself. It's like mirrored on the mirror. It actually ends up looking pretty good, but it isn't just body colored or standard black like virtually every other car. Now, that mirror trim is also included on the grille. If you walk up to the front of the car, you can see it isn't just black trim around the grille like every other luxury car. Instead, it's that same mirror material from the mirror. And personally, I think it looks pretty good. Also interesting on the grille is the little pad for the radar cruise control sensor. A lot of automakers have gotten pretty good at integrating this pad into their grilles, and Kia is apparently no exception. Take a look at this. It actually keeps the same pattern from the rest of the grille onto the pad itself, so you wouldn't necessarily know what you were looking at unless you knew what you were looking at. Next up, while we're still up front, moving under the hood, you'll find there isn't anything particularly unusual or surprising under here, except for one surprise. That would be the plastic engine cover. It doesn't say Kia on it or Stinger GT. Instead, it says Turbo in giant red print, like it's some sort of 80s car with turbo down the side. I guess they really want to emphasize that this is a turbo. Next up, while I'm still on the exterior of this car, I gotta talk vents. Now, I recently reviewed the Chevy SS, and I told you that all of the exterior vents in the SS are fake. Well, this car has a lot of similarities with the SS, but fully fake vents is not one of them. There are some functional vents in this car. For example, the vent in the front bumper allows air to come through, and the vent directly behind the front wheels also allows air to pass through to improve the car's aerodynamics. With that said, there are a couple of vents on the outside of this car that are there just for style. For example, these hood vents are just plastic. They don't allow any air in or out. They don't do anything. And same for the vents behind the rear wheels and back. And speaking of interesting style in the Stinger GT, one of the most unusual design details is around back, and that would be this thing. It's a reflector. Now, all cars are mandated by the federal government to have a red reflector in the rear somewhere in the side, but they're certainly not mandated to have one that's like a foot long. This thing doesn't light up, it doesn't turn on when the turn signal's on, it's just there. Now in a red car, it's hidden pretty well and it is sort of incorporated into the color of the car, but here's how it looks on a non-red Stinger. Now this reflector has caused some controversy. The Stinger GT is generally agreed to be a pretty attractive car, but this reflector is the one piece where no one's really sure why they did it, why they put a reflector down the side that goes halfway into the rear fender, but it's there. And speaking of unusual red items in the design of this car, how about the brakes? Take a close look. Those are Brembo brakes, just like a sports car would have. I bet you haven't seen that before on a Kia. Also interesting in terms of design in that vicinity, take a look at the wheels, specifically the middle. It looks like a center lock wheel, like a 911 Turbo or a Carrera GT. Well, obviously that's fake. It is kind of a cool look, but the interesting thing is under that little fake center lock cap, that isn't even where the lug nuts are. That fake center lock cap is part of a larger part that has 5 spokes coming off of it. You pull that off and that will reveal the lug nut. So it's a fake center lock and it's like a fake center cap. But I will say, if you look at that wheel design as a whole, I think it looks really nice, and it looks really nice in context for this entire car. But let's go back a second. I just put up a picture of the center cap with that E logo in the middle. What's that all about? Well, in the Korean market, the Stinger has E badges all over instead of Kia badges to signify that it's engineered for excellence. I'm dead serious. Next up, moving on to the back of the Stinger GT. Now, in spite of that strange reflector down the side, the tail lights and brake lights in this car are pretty normal. Now, there's a light bar going across the entire rear of the car, but it isn't functional. When you turn on the headlights and the tail lights light up, or when you put on the brakes, it doesn't light up. Instead, the brake lights and tail lights light up over here, just like normal brake lights and tail lights. Maybe the only interesting thing in the lighting assembly back here is the turn signals. Put on the turn signals in the back, you can see that they light up with this little hexagon pattern in the middle of them. That is the same pattern you will find on the front grille of the car carried over into the back. Another interesting thing in the back of the Stinger GT, this car has quad exhausts. And yes, they are functional quad exhausts. You can see that the tailpipes actually come out through the little holes on the bumper of the car, which is getting increasingly unusual in the world of over-styling and aggressive car designs. For those of you interested in knowing how the Stinger GT sounds when it revs up, well, take a listen. Also interesting, this particular model has a little film applied over the bumper so that when you're loading something in and you accidentally hit the bumper, you won't chip or scratch your paint. On that film is printed the word Stinger, and it's one of the only times the word Stinger actually appears on this car. It's also on the rear deck lid itself, and then not anywhere else. In fact, it doesn't appear anywhere in the interior, which is surprising. There are a lot of Kia badges on this car, but not many Stinger badges. Now, 2 other interesting things about the Stinger GT on the outside before I move inside of it. One of those things is the key. Now, when you want to go and lock the Stinger GT, you don't just push a little button on a key fob. Instead, the key is arranged so that the lock looks like you're detonating a bomb or an explosive charge. It is so cool. I really like it. The other thing you can do from the key is one of the Stinger GT's most interesting party tricks. That would be raise the tailgate. That's right. Even though this thing looks like a sedan, even though this thing will compete primarily with sedans like BMW, Audi A4, it's actually a hatchback like a Panamera or an Audi A7. And if you take a look back here, you'll be surprised to find there's a decent amount of room in this thing. So it isn't just a sport sedan, it's sort of a sport practical hatchback. Next up, moving on from the trunk area, when you get inside the Stinger GT, you'll notice a couple of interesting quirks and features, one of which is as soon as you open the door, you'll notice that the door sill plates, they don't say anything on them. The ones in the Kia Sorento say Sorento on them, but this car, they're just blank. It doesn't even say Kia. Kia does put a lot of its Kia logos all over this car, but it's like they don't want you to necessarily know that it's a Stinger, they just want you to know that it's a Kia. The model is secondary, which is sort of an interesting decision. Next up, I gotta talk about the multicolor screen in the gauge cluster. I really like this screen, and it has some unusual functions, one of which is when you start the car, it provides a little system check. Now, a lot of cars do this, but the cool thing about this one is the way it does the system check. It's like the car is driving into a virtual square to be completely checked over. I think that's a cool little graphic. I also like the fact that when you turn on the headlights, you're not just relying on the position of the stalk to let you know where the headlights are. car. Instead, you can actually see it in this little graphic display. That's a really good idea. And it's the same for the wipers. When you put the wipers on, you know how sometimes you put them on and you're like, is it on auto? Is it on intermittent? Is it on middle intermittent? I'm not really sure. Well, you can just look on the graphic and they will tell you exactly where the wipers are, so you don't have to look on the stock itself and try to figure out which position it's in, and that is smart. Next up, like most luxury sports cars in this price point, this car has a heads-up display, a multicolor heads-up display. And one of the interesting things that I find about this heads-up display is just how much you can change it. In a lot of cars, it's configurable and you can move it up or down. In this one, you can also rotate it to the side. I have no idea why anyone would want to do that, but you can. You can also change a couple of different things about it. One of my favorites is the color of the speed readout. You can have it green or orange or white. If, for example, your favorite color is green, well, then you can look at your speed in green instead of in orange or in white. In fact, that little screen lets you configure a lot of things that you can't configure on other vehicles. One of my favorites is the number of times the turn signals flash when you tap the turn signal stalk. In most cars, you tap the stalk, it flashes 3 times so you can make a quick lane change. In this car, you can choose how many times it flashes. I haven't really seen that before in a lot of other cars. Now, moving on from that interesting screen and all of its functions, there are a couple of other interesting quirks in this car. For example, the buttons for the heated and cooled seats. They're not just buttons like in every other car. Instead, it's a little toggle switch. You push it up for heated, you push it down for cooled, and the lights above the toggle switches change color depending on whether you're getting your seats heated or cooled. And yes, this car has heated and cooled seats. In fact, this car has pretty much everything. This car is absolutely loaded. I mentioned the heads-up display, but heated, cooled seats, leather seats. It has every modern active safety feature, from adaptive cruise control to lane departure warning, lane keep assist. It is full of stuff. In addition, it's not just about the features and equipment this car has, but just how nice everything is. This is the nicest Kia I've ever been in. Every button and switch looks good and feels good. The interior materials are excellent. Look at this finish on the doors, the silver finish. It's just beautiful. If it wasn't a Kia, instead it was a BMW or Mercedes-Benz, I can imagine this thing's price tag would probably start with a 7, especially when you factor in 365 horsepower and rear or all-wheel drive. One example of something that feels especially expensive, that would be the vents in the center and the interior here. They move around so you can place them basically anywhere you want to, but they don't feel cheap. When you move them, you actually have to put a little effort into them because they feel like they're really rooted in there. It's a nice feeling. And when you want to turn them off or turn them back on, they close and open with a nice little satisfying click sound. And speaking of satisfying sounds, another thing you can configure in that gauge cluster screen is a little welcome sound that welcomes you to the car every time you get in, or says goodbye every time you get out. Take a listen. That is one of the strangest vehicle sounds I've ever heard. It has no place in a performance luxury sports sedan like this one, but that little screen lets you configure everything else, so why not a little welcome and goodbye sound, I guess. Now, speaking of screens, the center screen inside the interior here is quite nice. It's large, like you'd expect from a modern car. And more importantly, when you touch it, it has virtually no lag when you're trying to move around and look at all the controls and go from screen to screen. It's really nice. Just move your finger and the screen moves just like you'd expect from your smartphone. And I really like that. There are also a couple of other interesting quirks inside the screen worth mentioning. One of them is the drive mode change alert feature, which is very interesting. Now, this car has, like most performance cars, different drive modes. You can go eco or normal or sport, whatever. And when you change the little dial so that you can go between modes, a little graphic of the car comes up on the infotainment screen showing it going into each different mode. But if you go into the drive mode change feature, you can change what shows up. Maybe you don't want to look at that graphic. Instead, you just want it to tell you when you're in a new mode. So you can set it so that it doesn't show the graphic of the entire vehicle, or you can just turn it completely off so that when you go between modes, it only shows up on the little screen in the gauge cluster and not in the middle. I have no idea why this is configurable. Every other car, you change the mode and it just pops up and everybody kind of lives with it. But in this car, a lot of stuff is configurable, and that's one of the strange ones. Something I absolutely love that this car allows you to configure, that would be the steering wheel stereo mode. Now, in most cars, when you're trying to switch between mode, AM, FM, XM radio, CD player, whatever, on your steering wheel, wheel, you got to sit through every single mode to get to the one you want. But in this car, you can make it so some modes don't appear. For example, no one still listens to AM radio, so you can just take that one right off the mode button's functionality. So when you're scrolling through things, AM radio won't show up and it'll skip right from FM to XM. Maybe the only things you use are FM radio and your iPod. Well, you can get rid of everything else, so when you press mode, it just cycles between FM radio and iPod. That is a really good idea that everybody should look into adopting. Another interesting thing about the center screen, it gives you the ability to change keyboards. You can have a usual QWERTY keyboard, like in most computers in North America and elsewhere, or you can have an ABCD keyboard and you can change that. I've never really seen that before. Most cars just kind of give you something and you're stuck with it and you adapt, but this car lets the car adapt to you. And speaking of the interior, let's talk back seats. This car is pretty large and the front seat is in fairly normal place, and look at me, I fit just fine. And as you know, I'm 6'3", 6'4", I'm pretty tall, and I fit back here just fine. Now, aside from the legroom, this is a fairly standard back seat. The headroom is decent. It's cut down a little bit by sort of the coupe-like profile in this car, but I can sit up and I don't really have a problem. Maybe the most interesting thing in the back seat is how nice everything is back here. It even has that gorgeous silver trim on the rear door panels, which it definitely doesn't need to have. It also has a couple of more of those really nice air vents that move around and click like I liked up front. Otherwise, this is a fairly normal back seat that you'd expect from basically any other luxury car, just maybe not a Kia. So those are all the quirks and the features of the Stinger GT, and now it's time to get this thing out on the road and find out if Kia has really built a sports sedan that's competitive with BMW and Audi and Cadillac and Mercedes-Benz. And for more of my thoughts on the Stinger GT, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also got a listing of the lowest mileage older Kia models currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. For now, time to drive. First impression, the car feels kind of like a luxury car, actually. It feels pretty insulated from the road, like a luxury car does. The steering has sort of that stable, strong feel to it that you'd expect from a luxury car. It's like Kia knows what they're doing. The turn signals work like normal, unlike in all these BMWs and crap. You just put it up and then the turn signal stays up, and that's how it just should be. We're gonna accelerate a little bit here. Wow. Yeah, it's nice and quick. It really does feel like all of 365 horsepower. The twin turbocharged, even though it's turbocharged, it doesn't feel like it has any lag. That's kind of, I guess, a benefit of the twin turbochargers. Wow, yeah, it's strong. Man, I've been driving around in a Lexus RCF. It doesn't feel much slower than that car, even though it's got 100 less horsepower. The sound is not like a muscle car. I think this is more of a car that you can drive as a normal person if you want to just kind of drive around town. The exhaust sound is good to say, but it could be, I mean, if it was, it's not a V8 and it's not a muscle car, it's not a sports car. I think they were going for sort of that like sports sedan demographic who actually is going to use this thing to commute. They don't want their car to annoy them at all hours. The thing that's, I think, the most impressive, even just in a short, I'm 5 minutes behind the wheel, you can already tell the thing that's most impressive is the handling. This is not a very small car. It has a big back seat, it has a big trunk, it's very practical, and yet the steering is sharp, it's quick. The handling is real precise. That is actually surprised me more than the acceleration. The acceleration is about on par with what I expected given the horsepower number and all that. It's not really all that surprising. But the steering, it feels like almost like a sports car, which is impressive for a vehicle of this size. And it's especially impressive because I looked at it when I see a Kia badge on the steering wheel. The whole thing is very impressive. There's very little body lean. The steering is tremendously direct, and it's not vague, which is weird because so many modern cars, even good modern cars, Jaguars and BMWs and that sort of thing, sort of feel over-assisted and vague, and this is less like that. The transmission, it would be nice to have a dual clutch. I mean, that's sort of a reality of a true performance car these days, is that they have a dual clutch. This is sort of the next best thing. It's a quick and smooth, torque converter auto, and at this price point, you can't really beat them up too much for not including a dual clutch. They would have to make it almost specifically for this car. If this were a car that was $75,000, you'd say, well, they really needed to put in a dual clutch. Everything feels really nice. When I touch the turn signal, it doesn't feel like it's wobbly. I'm not hearing any creaks or rattles, which is nice because this is like one of the very first delivered of a brand new car in the first model year. Everything is screwed together well, and also in the interior, everything just looks nice, and the buttons just feel so good. They feel like luxury car buttons. It's really quite impressive how
how everything is kind of put together. They really clearly studied real performance luxury sedans and made this a true competitor to those. I mean, as obviously the biggest, drawback or question mark with this car is going to be the brand name. Driving it now, it's very clear that it won't be the driving experience or the acceleration or anything like that. It's going to be more, are people willing to get this out of a Kia?
And so that's the 2018 Kia Stinger GT. It is excellent. It's also a great deal. This thing has 365 horsepower and starts around $39,000. A base level BMW 540i has 335 horsepower and starts at $56,000. If you add every single option to one of these, you obviously have a lot more equipment than that base level 540i, and you're still cheaper. So this thing drives well, it's good looking, it's a great value, it's fast, it's fun. Do I think it's going to be a success?
Not quite. And there are two reasons why. One is obvious. It's a Kia. BMW drivers aren't going to leave behind their premium luxury brand just because this thing is $100 cheaper a month and has 30 more horsepower. This car is a great value, but the sports sedan market is competitive, and this thing isn't going to crash through any sales records right away. I think Kia knows that in their limiting supply. They realize this isn't going to light the world on fire immediately, but it's a great match to get that fire started. The other reason I don't think this car will be a huge success is this. SUVs, SUVs, SUVs. The BMW 5 Series sold less than 35,000 units in 2016 for the first time in 2 decades. The Audi A6 in 2016 sold just over half of what it did in 2002. Buyers are migrating to SUVs, and I sincerely hope the Stinger GT is followed up soon with a luxury performance SUV, maybe the Hornet GT. Car enthusiasts may prefer sporty coupes and sedans, but you can't argue that SUVs are what buyers want.
But if you don't want an SUV, if you want a sports sedan, and a gorgeous sports sedan with great performance and great power and a great value and excellent styling and features, and you want to be a bit of a trailblazer, you don't want the same BMW or Mercedes-Benz that your neighbor has, well, then this is your car, and you're gonna love it. And now it's time for the Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Stinger GT is quite simply a handsome car, and it easily earns a 7 out of 10. Acceleration, it does 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds, which earns it a 6 out of 10 on the Doug score acceleration scale. Handling is very sharp for a sedan into sports car category, and it earns itself a 6 out of 10. Cool factor isn't very strong. The Stinger GT is cool right now in the car community, but most normal people have no idea what it is. That combined with the Kia badge and that mediocre exhaust node, and it gets just a 6 out of 10. Finally, there's importance, and this is a fun, exciting new car, but not a highly significant one to the automotive world, and it sticks right in the middle with a 5 out of 10. Add it all up, and the total weekend score is 30 out of 50, which is decent for a four-door car, but not amazingly excellent. Next, we move on to the daily score, starting with features. The Stinger GT is loaded with basically everything you'd expect from a modern luxury car, but it's short on the very craziest new gadgets like any automated features, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Next up is comfort, and the Stinger GT boasts nice, well-bolstered sport seats and excellent ride quality. It gets a 7 out of 10. In terms of quality, the Stinger GT is good. The interior is well made and everything fits together right. Plus, the long 10-year, 100,000-mile warranty gives you a lot of peace of mind in terms of reliability, and it gets an 8 out of 10. For practicality, the Stinger GT has a big rear area with 40.9 cubic feet of cargo space, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, there's value, and even at a $50,000 plus sticker price, this thing is a great deal. If it were a BMW equipped this way with this much power, it'd be an easy 10, but the Kia badge knocks it down to an 8 out of 10, giving it a total score of 37 out of 50, just below the top. Add it all up, and the total Doug score is 67 out of 100, which is an impressive number for a Kia, scoring dangerously close to the top of the chart. It's just a really good all-around car.